Hello, bio students. You've made it to our last lecture in our unit on ecology, and we're going to be looking at ecological succession today. So before we jump into that, let's just quick take a look, review the items that you need to be completing this week. You have a few videos that you need to have watched. You should have notes on those videos. Those videos are all in Edpuzzle. And then you also have the carbon cycle worksheet that you should also be submitting this week as well. All right, so let's jump right into ecological succession. And when we start out, I just want to first deal with the word succession. And when you think of succession, maybe you think of royal succession, where one king succeeds the previous king, and then after that, another king arises and succeeds that king as well. So now when we're talking about ecological succession, rather than one king succeeding another king, now we're looking at an ecological community that succeeds a previous ecological community. So we're looking at a change in the ecological community, or the makeup of an ecological community over time. All right, so in 1899, H.C. Cowles published a really important study in ecology, and it was titled The Ecological Relations of the Vegetation of the Sand Dunes of Lake Michigan. And in this study, he was the first ecologist to describe this idea of ecological succession. And he also described this idea of these changes in ecological communities leading to what's called a climax community. So these are things that we're going to be looking at in class today. The area that he did his study is along the kind of the southeast side of Lake Michigan in North America, and it's now, in the last couple of years, it's become a new national park called Indiana Dunes National Park. All right, so let's go right ahead and define ecological succession a little bit more specifically. So we can define ecological succession as the sequence of community and ecosystem changes that occur after a disturbance. So a couple things here. So community, remember, is all of the different species of living organisms in a certain place. And the ecosystem includes a bit more than that. It includes all of the community, but it also includes the non-living components of an ecosystem. So in ecological succession, we're going to see changes in what species are present and what species dominate the ecosystem. And we're also going to see changes in the abiotic components of the ecosystem. Right, so what is a disturbance? A disturbance is going to be defined as an event that changes a community, removes organisms from it, and alters the available resources. So some examples, one example would be a volcano. So you can see in the picture here, a volcano is just occurring, and as lava and ash cover all of the ecosystem, basically it wipes the slate clean, and there's nothing living remaining. And then over many, many years, we start to see new organisms begin to repopulate that area. And then if we would wait hundreds of years, we would see more changes that would take place. Other things that could represent a disturbance would be a forest fire, floods, glaciers, and even human-caused ecological disturbances like clear cutting of a forest. Right. So, in order to have succession, it's like you have to do some damage to the ecosystem, remove organisms from it, and then we're watching to see, will that ecosystem kind of progress back to its original state or to something different. All right, so there's two categories of ecological succession that I want you to be comfortable with. The first is primary succession. And this occurs when there's a disturbance that actually removes all the soil from an ecosystem. So it either moves the soil away or completely buries the soil. So our example of the volcano would be an example of primary succession because the lava and ash completely bury the soil that was present. Um, Another example that I mentioned is a glacier. So a glacier, as it retreats, it melts back. This glacier here is melting back, and as it does that, it exposes new rocky surfaces. So if you look here, this might represent the most recently exposed surface as a glacier is retreating toward the left on our screen. And so that exposed rock doesn't have any soil. Rock is not soil, large, flat rocks. All right, soil, we're talking about small grains and organic material as well. And so when you only have soil, there's no organisms in the soil. It's basically lifeless. And so the first thing that you need in order to begin succession is a pioneer species. And so what's going to generally happen is spores from fungi or spore producing plants or even seeds will get transported by wind or by birds or other animals into this area and deposited, and they have to be able to grow in conditions where there's very little soil. All right, but once they begin to grow, then they begin to change the ecosystem. And over time, as more and more life comes in, the ecosystem is changing. And as we move to the right, we're looking forward through time, maybe hundreds of years. And we're seeing the development, especially here, of soil. I want you to notice that. Okay, so that's primary succession. The second type of ecological succession, the second type is secondary. And this is where you have a disturbance that does change the community, but it doesn't remove or make the soil unavailable. So right away, there's going to be organisms or life, seeds, spores that remain after the disturbance. And so this type of succession, there's already life there. And so it's going to progress much more quickly than primary succession. So a forest fire would be an example of this. And when a forest fire sweeps through a forest, there's many, many seeds that are in the soil after that fire dies down. And in fact, many seeds in forests require really high heat from a forest fire before they'll start to germinate. So right away, within weeks after the forest fire, you're going to have the growth of plants. Where in primary succession, it's going to take a long time before you start to have an abundance of even small plants. Okay, so let's move on and see if you can recognize what type of succession do you see occurring in this picture. All right, and so again, we're looking at not a single scene, right? This is a scene that's changing over time. So this is early and then later and late, okay? Hundreds of years is passing. And you see we're starting with bare rock, right? That would be your evidence. And that means, hopefully you're thinking of primary succession. So what type of event might have caused this succession? Glaciation. As glaciers retreat, you're going to have just bare rock. And in this case, your first stage, sometimes these stages are often called seral stages or seral communities, or even just sears. So the pioneer species are lichens that spread as spores. And then you have small plants, lichens still. Then you have still small plants and grasses. And then you have shade-tolerant shrubs. Shade intolerant. That means they're going to grow. They need lots of sunlight. And so you have shrubs that begin to grow, some trees, and then you get into the shade-tolerant trees that will grow even when there's trees that are growing over them. And this results in what's called the climax community. So at some point, the ecosystem is shaped to a point where the organisms that are present are the most fit for that ecosystem. And so they're not going to be pushed out by other organisms that come in later. They're going to just continue to dominate for years and years. Okay, another really nice graph showing ecological succession is shown here. And I really like this graph. I'm going to just try to quickly explain it for you guys. You see here the numbers represent kind of descriptions of what the ecosystem would have been like. And so you see bare rock here, and then you have mosses and grasses and so on, all the way up to the climax forest at number 6. Now, what I like is this top part. So what we can see is that initially bare rock dominates, right? But as we start to have grasses and mosses enter and grow, they start covering up that bare rock. And so the amount of bare rock is decreasing, all right? And then over time, now we're at number 2, where the grasses and mosses are dominating. However, more grasses and perennials, number 3, are going to start to enter the ecosystem, and there's maybe a thin layer of soil that's growing that makes it possible for them to exist. So they are going to start out-competing these early mosses and early grasses until those mosses and grasses decrease in their percentage of the community, and the third cereal stage comes to dominate. And we see this just continuing stage after stage after stage after stage until finally we get the climax forest, which dominates. The thing I want you to notice here is look at how biodiversity changes, right? You can see that really clearly here. There's not very many species early on. By the end, there's all of those different stages are still represented, but the biodiversity is greatest at the end. All right, so it's a good example, excuse me, of ecological succession. At the bottom here, we see the same thing: the biodiversity, the biomass, and the soil layer, like the thickness of the soil, are all increasing over this period of time. All right, so that would be an example of a change in some of the abiotic conditions as well. Okay, let's look at a couple examples. All right, so here's another example. What type of succession is occurring in this picture? Well, we have soil that's still present. It looks like a forest fire, and that's exactly correct. So we see soil present. What term would an ecologist use to describe the fire? That would be a disturbance, right? And this fire in Yellowstone National Park that occurred in 1988 resulted very quickly in the resurgence of life, or we see the resurgence of life very quickly. Only 1 year after the fire, and these purple lupin wildflowers are growing throughout the forest area. All right, one more illustration. I really like this illustration. Actually, a couple more examples. What type of succession is occurring in this picture? This is actually a little bit tricky. This is the Lake Michigan sand dunes that H.C. Cowles studied succession at. And what he did is he started in these dunes that are far away from the lake, and then he studied at different distances from the lake, because dunes are always migrating away from the lake shore. And so these would be the oldest, and this would be the newest. And so here is where we could imagine succession beginning just on bare sand. And sand is not considered soil, so this would be an example of primary succession, where we see grasses growing initially, and then you have some pine trees, and then oaks, and then the beech maple forests would represent the climax community. You can also see the soil level getting thicker as you go away from the lakeshore. All right, another example is in Glacier Bay, Alaska, with this retreating glacier. In 1760, we know that the glacier came all the way to the mouth of the bay. And in 1860, it had retreated back to this point, 1907 to here, 1941 to here. And so we can look at what is the plant life along this continuum, and look at that as an example of succession. So first we have the pioneer stage, which we see way back here where the Great Glacier has just most recently retreated. And then as we move forward, we're actually we can think of it as we're moving back in time. This has been exposed or uncovered from the glacier for a longer period of time. And now we get into a new stage called the driest stage. As we move farther forward, we're moving farther away from the glacier, and we get into the alder stage. So now we have deciduous trees. And then finally, we get to the spruce stage, which is the climax stage. And we can study the soil in these different stages and see that many of the nutrients, the pH, the nitrogen content, has also changed. So in the pioneer stage and driest stage, nitrogen concentration is very low. But then as we move into the alder and spruce stage, the nitrogen concentration has increased significantly. So succession changes not just the living organisms that are found, but also some of the abiotic conditions of the environment as well. One more example of succession, just so that you know, ecological succession is not just in plant life. We also can look at ecological succession in the microbiota of a baby human. So the makeup of the microbes within the gut of a human are changing, and the biodiversity is increasing over the first few years of a child's life. And we have several factors that are influential in determining what microbes are going to be found in that baby's gut. The placenta, the type of delivery, the type of food that they eat, where that baby lives, like what family members, probably if they have pets or not in their house. So all of these things lead to differences in the makeup of that gut microbiome, and that can be thought of as ecological succession as well, where we reach a climax community after about 3 years. All right, so these are examples of ecological succession. Hopefully that helps in your understanding, and we will stop there. Have a great day.